Right, to our final speaker, we've got Marie. Let me just get my notes, get myself, Dr. Marie Fisk. And now she's going to be talking to you about clinical trials, policy, best practice and regulation, harmonizing the process for assessing and supervision of clinical trials and protecting the rights, safety and well-being of research participants. So this idea that you don't just do clinical trials, you really have to think about the participants. And that, when I teach clinical trials to my students, that's something I say it's a really important thing. Now, Dr. Fisk is a clinical lecturer in the Department of Medicine as part of the Experimental Medicine Initiative at the University of Cambridge. And she's a dual trainee clinical pharmacology and respiratory medicine. Her research interests are to improve poor health burden associated with respiratory diseases. And I could go on, but I think it's best if I let Marie talk about her research. And again, we can come back afterwards and have a bit more about your background and all the kind of things you do. So over to you, Marie.
So thank you so much, Winston, and thank you to the Society for inviting me to join this really important webinar. And it's something I'm very passionate about, and I hope to do it justice in terms of this short talk. So I've decided to sort of actually tackle the big question of inequity in clinical research more broadly in my talk, but I certainly will talk a little bit about this as well. So for me, actually, as a doctor in respiratory medicine, the one thing I would like to start my talk with is about health inequality. And actually, health inequality and inequity in clinical research are so intrinsically linked. I think it is really important for us to sort of understand this process. Now, this is a really helpful schematic from NHS Scotland, and I think it lays out really nicely the fundamental causes, the environmental influences, and the individual experience that leads to health inequality. And what we need to do in terms of certainly undoing society unfairness, preventing environmental factors that may lead to health inequality, and mitigating for the individual factors that may lead to health inequality. And as a respiratory doctor, I just want to certainly say that I am very much agreed and very much aware of health inequality in terms of treating patients with respiratory disease. Now, this is a recent study from the Health Foundation, just published in August of this year. And COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, is over 3 times more common in areas of the UK that are the most deprived in comparison to the least deprived areas. Now, that is a significant statistic. And analysis from the Health Foundation in this study also showed that patients from ethnic groups from the Bangladeshi community, Pakistani and Black Caribbean community lived significantly longer in poor health than patients from other racial groups or ethnic groups. So this is the situation that we're in at the moment in terms of the UK, in terms of health inequality. And I think we are all acutely aware of this problem. But I would like to say that it is intrinsically linked, certainly in terms of inequity in clinical research also. And if we think about clinical research, again, if we lay it out in this schematic, we can have fundamental causes of inequity in clinical research. And this may be certainly in our trial design, our strict inclusion-exclusion criteria of your typical sort of pharmacological trial undertaken in academic centres, so excluding underrepresented groups. And actually, your average person in the UK does not have access to research, or maybe with a hospital site or a GP that doesn't participate in research. There might be social and community reasons why they may not think about taking part in research, and trust is a big element there. And also their individual experience in terms of certainly trying to facilitate them to take part in research. And communication actually and ease of taking part in research is really key here. And the overall effect of this is that this inequity in clinical research perpetuates the health inequalities that we are dealing with every day in the NHS and in health care systems across the world. And our approach in terms of tackling inequity in clinical research is that we need certainly clinical trials policy we need from government and from societies. We need to tackle these fundamental causes. And we then need a more holistic and community approach in terms of dealing with these particular reasons, and also thinking always about the individual patient to try and facilitate and improve their experience of hopefully participating and having access to clinical research. What is the current situation at the moment in clinical research here in the UK? So I know that all of us are very aware of the COVID-19 pandemic, where 33% of patients in the intensive care unit were from Black, African and minority ethnic groups. And this is despite making up only 13% of the population. And I will talk a little bit later in my talk just a bit about how some research groups have tried to address this significant problem. And another aspect is certainly the UK Biobank study, which is an excellent study, observational study, looking at finding very important outcomes in terms of certain diseases. But there is this healthy volunteer bias, so that patients who are, or participants, I should say, who are in the UK Biobank are less likely to be obese, less likely to smoke, drink alcohol. They actually have lower mortality and they live in less socially deprived areas and have fewer long-term conditions. So there is this disconnect between your traditional trial study population and actually the real world populations that we see and care for in our clinic. And why is this important? So this is really important to know that hospitals that actually participate in clinical research have better outcomes. Participants in clinical research have better outcomes. And that's particularly the case in oncology trials. And if you think about it, if you're a participant in an oncology trial, you have access to the latest novel therapies, which if you don't have access to participating in clinical research, you don't have that access to those novel therapies. And research needs to be translatable and it needs to be generalizable to the real world population with a given condition. And I really would like to say that clinical research is part of healthcare and it needs to be embedded in the culture of the NHS, and inequities and disparities that we see in health outcomes and in clinical research in terms of lack of access or inequity in clinical research, I think reflect the same issues and are intrinsically linked. And there is work that is undergoing here in the UK to try and address this problem. You may have heard of the Include project, which is run by the NIHR. And I think this really nicely sets out sort of what we need to do to address this problem. And it needs to be a research priority. Certainly, research needs to be undertaken in underrepresented groups. We need to have funding. It needs to be a key research priority. And then in terms of the initial study design and how the research actually is focused towards patients from underrepresented groups, this is absolutely key. And then in how it's actually delivered and how that research then feeds back and actually impacts real world patients and clinical care. And just to sort of highlight, you may be very aware of this already, but I find this website very useful indeed, and the work that they do needs certainly to be highlighted, and do go and have a look at their website. So there's the Centre for Ethnic Health Research, which is run by the University of Leicester with the NIHR. Their one clear vision is to reduce ethnic health inequalities. And I can talk certainly outside of this short presentation about some of the work that they do. Do go and have a look at their website in terms of the projects they do. It's excellent work, and we certainly need to shine a light on that much more so. So briefly, just thinking about the clinical research life cycle and where to tackle inequity. The main thing to think about is that your patients is at the heart of your research. It's their lived experience of their condition and what is important to the patient. How can we improve their health? So you've got here, I realise this is quite a busy slide, but certainly you need to think about the trial and the study design. And that certainly is in terms of many aspects, in terms of actually how the trial may come together in terms of its design, certainly from its materials, available to the patients, inclusion and exclusion criteria. And this is the participant information sheet, for example. What's the number of visits and assessments? And is the patient involved in terms of accessibility, in terms of taking part in that study design? And then it's actually the delivery. So once you've gone through the process, I think, of making sure you have equity of access in terms of the design of the trial, it's actually how can you deliver it? And the key there, it's one thing that Winston said earlier, is that certainly it's taking out of the traditional research sites, and it needs to be in the community, and it needs to be in sites that are not your traditional research sites, in communities that are currently underrepresented in terms of clinical research. And I think building trust and a pragmatic approach to trials and reducing barriers to participation is key. So just briefly talking about actually sort of the framework of how clinical trials take part in the UK. So we have laws, we have the UK Clinical Trials Regulation, and that's sort of our framework, and we have to follow clinical trials regulations for that. We've got the MHRA and the research ethic committees, that there's a joint approval process now for clinical trials. And one thing to say is that the REC, the Health Research Authority REC committees, their sole purpose is to protect the research participants' interests while facilitating ethical research. And patient participation, involvement and engagement is key to this process. And actually that's so at the heart of how we can make things better in terms of equity of access and facilitating clinical research. And just a few brief examples here. So I've spoke about the disproportionate burden of COVID-19 in different ethnic minority groups. Now, this is Professor Mahendra Patel. You may know him. He's a pharmacist, and he was the lead of community outreach work in the COVID-19 trials, the panoramic and the principal trials. He did so much individual work. He spoke to the Islamic Medical Association. He went to the Hindu temples. He spoke to all pharmacists across the UK, and he did so much work to try and involve communities that have until this point been underrepresented in clinical research in the UK, to try and get them on board and to certainly take part and see why it was so important for them to take part in COVID-19 research. And this is just one of my examples. It's a different condition. It's COPD, so it's a condition that tends to affect more elderly people. And as you can see, this is actually a study, this is a map of the UK, and this is the NIHR map, which shows where respiratory or COPD research takes place in the UK. And actually, there's a complete mismatch to where COPD is most prevalent. It's most prevalent here in the Northeast and the Northwest, and that's where the research should be taking place. So what I'm hoping to do in my trial, which is the OPACE trial in COPD, is try and certainly do it in those areas. I won't go through this slide, but this is certainly some of the aspects from a very practical perspective of trying to ensure that research is done in the areas where the condition such as COPD is most prevalent. So my brief take-home message is that equity of access needs to be considered through the life cycle of a clinical research project. At the funding, at being a research priority, in your patient and public involvement and engagement, in the trial design, and also in its delivery and application of the results in terms of our clinical practice. And the study population needs to reflect the real world population. And it is so important to facilitate participation in research, and it needs to be embedded as a routine research culture to enable equity of access to research and healthcare in the NHS. I would just like to thank the patients that I see in my clinic, the patients involved in helping me set up the OPACE trial, its design, which is funded by the NIHR, and input from Asthma Lung UK and our local East of England Clinical Research Network. So thank you. And thank you to the Society for the opportunity to talk today.